The rooms are still there. Behind an unassuming facade on Madison Avenue, their ceilings remain impossibly high, their fireplaces intact, their marble cool beneath careful footsteps. Guests move through them without knowing that they are crossing the remains of something far more deliberate than a hotel interior. The walls once absorbed the confidence of men who believed capital could reorder the republic. Today, they absorb conference calls. The Villard Houses were not demolished. They were not dramatically abandoned. They were absorbed, stitched into a modern commercial body that tolerates them as ornament. What was once conceived as a unified statement of power now survives as a curated backdrop, preserved but functionally displaced. There is no ruin to mourn, no visible collapse, only a shift in purpose so complete that the original intention has become almost unspeakable. This story matters because it is not about destruction, it is about dilution. About how a palace built to embody a private empire was gradually converted into a decorative appendix of corporate Manhattan. The structure stands. The ideology does not. The Villard Houses are still in use. And that is precisely the problem. On a narrow stretch of Madison Avenue, the Villard Houses remain intact, their brownstone and limestone facades disciplined and composed against the vertical glass that now surrounds them. They do not announce themselves. The scale is restrained, almost recessive, overshadowed by the adjacent tower that rises with corporate indifference. From the street, the compound appears preserved. Its windows are polished. Its cornices are intact. Nothing suggests absence. Yet the structure no longer governs its own interior life. Where carriage traffic once defined its perimeter, revolving doors now mediate entry. A concierge desk stands where access was once restricted by private staff. The courtyard, originally conceived as an insulated architectural pause within the city, has become an aesthetic amenity, an atmospheric interlude between lobby and ballroom. The spatial logic remains legible, but its authority has been reassigned. The transformation did not require demolition. It required reclassification. The Villard Houses were conceived as a compound, 6 interconnected residences arranged around a central courtyard, unified by architectural discipline and a singular patronage. Their purpose was precise: to insulate wealth, to stage controlled sociability, and to translate financial capital into cultural permanence. That purpose depended on exclusivity. Entry was selective. Circulation was choreographed. The building's geometry reinforced hierarchy. Today, circulation follows a different mandate. Guests pass through corridors without lineage. The rooms host conferences, weddings, transient stays measured in nights rather than decades. The fireplaces are photographed. The ceilings are admired. The marble is maintained. But the governing principle of the space private dominion has dissolved. This is not decay, it is absorption. The hotel complex that now envelops the compound operates according to a global logic. Its revenue models, brand standards, staffing protocols, and seasonal fluctuations are coordinated across cities and continents. Within that system, the Villard Houses function as heritage capital. They are an asset differentiated by age and craftsmanship, incorporated into a portfolio of experiences. Their value is aesthetic continuity, not sovereign control. The surrounding tower, completed in the late 20th century, did not imitate the scale or ideology of the original houses. It asserted a new architectural hierarchy: height over horizontality, glass over masonry, efficiency over enclosure. The compound was retained not as a governing structure, but as a preserved frontage, integrated into a development calibrated for density and global commerce. The balance of power shifted vertically. What had once been a horizontal assertion of private empire, low, controlled, inward-facing, became a horizontal base beneath a vertical system. The tower generates the primary economic force. The houses provide distinction. They lend narrative depth to an otherwise contemporary complex. In this arrangement, preservation operates within constraint. Walls are maintained. Interiors are protected under landmark status, yet the operational sovereignty of the compound has been relinquished. Decisions are no longer made to serve a single household or even a singular ownership ideology. They are made within corporate frameworks, occupancy rates, event bookings, maintenance budgets, brand alignment. The building still breathes, but it does not decide. The shift from private residence to hospitality venue required an adjustment in tempo. Domestic time, measured in seasons, rituals, recurring guests of known identity, gave way to transactional time. Check-in and check-out replaced arrival and residence. The staff hierarchy changed accordingly. Where once there were footmen, cooks, household managers aligned to one patronage structure, there are now departments, front office, events, facilities, security. Their allegiance is procedural rather than personal. The rooms remain grand, but their intimacy has thinned. Absorption into the modern city did not erase the Villard Houses. It repositioned them within a broader machine. Manhattan itself evolved from a network of elite enclaves into a vertically integrated commercial organism. Land became leverage. Air rights became negotiable. Buildings became instruments within capital flows larger than individual dynasties. Within that transformation, the compound ceased to be a center. It became a layer. The tension is subtle but persistent, a structure built to embody consolidated authority now functioning as curated backdrop. The stone holds its shape. The ideology that animated it has been reassigned to systems less visible, more abstract, and far less localized. Absorption also altered the way the compound is perceived. When the Villard Houses operated as private residences, their meaning was implicit. One did not require signage to understand their status. The discipline of the facade, the controlled entry, the orchestration of carriage arrivals. These communicated hierarchy without explanation. Power was embedded in the structure's exclusivity. The building did not interpret itself. Within the hotel complex, interpretation has become necessary. Plaques identify architectural features. Staff describe the Renaissance inspiration. Guests are informed that these rooms once belonged to a railroad magnate. The building's authority is now narrated rather than enacted. It is contextualized for consumption. The compound's identity depends, in part, on explanation. This is not trivial. It signals a change in how space exerts influence. Originally, the houses shaped behavior through restriction. Their thresholds were barriers. Their courtyard was private enclosure. Movement within the compound followed an internal logic of privilege and service. That logic was invisible to outsiders because outsiders did not enter. Today, permeability defines the experience. The courtyard is traversed by visitors unfamiliar with its original insulation from the street. Event planners diagram its dimensions. Photographers frame its arches as visual assets. The compound accommodates visibility. Visibility, however, is not sovereignty. Operational authority resides elsewhere. The hotel's management does not answer to a single family's continuity, but to ownership structures, investment expectations, and brand governance. Financial performance is assessed quarterly. Programming adjusts to market demand. Renovations are scheduled according to profitability and regulatory compliance. Within these calculations, the Villard Houses occupy a specific category, protected historic space integrated into a revenue-generating ecosystem. Their preservation is negotiated, not assumed. Landmark designation ensures that walls remain standing, that ornamentation is restored rather than replaced. Yet landmark status cannot preserve function. It safeguards material form while allowing institutional purpose to evolve. The compound's architecture is conserved. Its original system of authority is not. The city's metabolism requires adaptation. Manhattan's central districts operate under continuous pressure. Zoning revisions, property valuation shifts, infrastructure upgrades. The Villard Houses exist within this pressure field. They are subject to it even as they appear timeless. Insurance policies, fire codes, accessibility standards, labor regulations. These govern their daily operation far more than the intentions of their first patron. In this environment, the compound's survival depends on compatibility with contemporary systems. The integration into a luxury hotel provided economic justification for maintenance that private inheritance no longer guaranteed. Without incorporation into a larger commercial entity, the houses might have faced fragmentation or neglect. Absorption ensured continuity of form, but at the cost of singularity. The building remains coherent in stone. It is no longer coherent in ideology. The surrounding tower casts more than literal shadow. It establishes scale and priority. Its height signals where economic force now concentrates. The compound, once sufficient unto itself, now reads as an architectural prelude to something larger. The vertical mass commands skyline recognition. The horizontal complex offers historical depth at ground level. This inversion is not accidental. It reflects the city's evolution from elite residential enclave to global capital node. Power migrated from individual magnates to institutional frameworks. Banks, corporations, multinational hospitality groups. Architecture followed. Within the hotel's interior, the Villard rooms are booked for private events that mimic, in diluted form, the exclusivity they once enforced. A wedding reception or corporate dinner may momentarily restore a sense of enclosure. Yet these occasions are temporary rentals. Authority is borrowed for an evening, not possessed. The compound's life is now cyclical and transactional. Occupancy fluctuates with seasons and conferences. Staff rotations follow corporate scheduling. Marketing materials circulate images of carved ceilings and fireplaces across digital platforms far removed from Madison Avenue. The building participates in a global narrative of curated heritage. It survives, but as component rather than command. Absorption into the modern city did not strip the Villard Houses of dignity. It recalibrated their role. They no longer anchor a private empire, they enhance a commercial one. The stone still holds its line against the street. The courtyard still encloses air and light. Yet the decisions that determine their future originate beyond their walls. The compound stands, intact and maintained, embedded within systems it does not control. In the final decades of the 19th century, wealth in Manhattan was expanding faster than its social vocabulary. Railroads, industrial consolidation, speculative finance. These produced fortunes of a scale previously unknown in the Republic. Yet capital alone did not confer legitimacy. The city's uppermost circles were governed by codes inherited from European precedent, lineage, restraint, architectural continuity. Money could purchase land, but it could not automatically secure cultural authority. Architecture became the mediator. Along Fifth Avenue and its adjoining streets, private residences assumed a role beyond shelter. They were instruments through which new wealth negotiated entry into an older hierarchy. Stone, symmetry, and stylistic discipline offered a language of permanence that the volatility of American markets could not guarantee. Facades were composed not merely to impress, but to assert stability in a city defined by rapid turnover. The Villard Houses emerged within this negotiation. Their significance lay not in scale alone, but in coordination. Rather than a single ostentatious mansion, the compound presented a unified architectural statement, multiple residences arranged with disciplined restraint around a private courtyard. This was not excess for spectacle. It was a calculated alignment with European aristocratic precedent, translated into a New York context. In a republic suspicious of hereditary titles yet enthralled by European refinement, architecture offered a solution. It could imply continuity without claiming nobility. It could embody tradition without invoking monarchy. For financiers whose wealth derived from speculation and expansion, this mattered. Fifth Avenue itself functioned as a stage. Proximity conveyed rank. The avenue's progression northward marked the migration of power away from older downtown commercial districts. To build along this corridor was to participate in a geographic reordering of influence. Yet participation required more than acreage. It required aesthetic coherence. Residences along the avenue were scrutinized as public statements. Their setbacks, cornices, and entryways communicated values. A facade too exuberant risked vulgarity. One too modest suggested insecurity. The balance had to be deliberate. Architecture regulated reputation. The Villard compound's Renaissance Revival vocabulary. Arched windows, rusticated stone, disciplined ornament projected cultivated restraint. It implied familiarity with European history, with Florence rather than frontier. This was essential in a city where industrial fortunes could appear abrupt, even destabilizing. The houses translated financial power into architectural continuity. Within this environment, domestic space became semi-public symbol. Although entry remained restricted, the exterior composition was continuously visible. Carriages paused before it. Pedestrians observed it. Newspapers commented upon it. The building's authority extended beyond its walls through perception. Architecture did what financial instruments could not. It slowed time. Markets fluctuated. Railroads expanded and contracted. Speculative bubbles formed and collapsed. A masonry facade, by contrast, suggested endurance. It implied that its patron intended not merely to profit but to remain. In a volatile republic, permanence required visible proof. The need for such proof was intensified by the social architecture of the era. Invitations, alliances, and marriages were negotiated within a tightly managed elite circle. Admission was selective. Reputation traveled through observation. A residence on Fifth Avenue operated as credential. Its design signaled alignment with accepted taste, and therefore with accepted society. The Villard Houses were not simply homes. They were arguments in stone. They argued that wealth generated by modern industry could coexist with cultivated tradition. They proposed that American capital could adopt European codes without forfeiting Republican identity. Their disciplined composition suggested that the patron's authority was measured rather than reckless. In this sense, architecture was defensive as much as declarative. It shielded new wealth from accusations of vulgarity. It stabilized perception. It created a physical environment in which financial ambition could be reframed as cultural stewardship. The compound's coherence mattered because fragmentation implied instability. A row of unrelated mansions might suggest individual assertion. A unified ensemble suggested collective order. The Villard Houses did not shout their presence, they consolidated it. In late 19th century Manhattan, such consolidation was essential. Wealth was abundant, legitimacy was scarce. The necessity for architectural assertion was also rooted in the instability of American identity itself. Unlike European capitals, Manhattan possessed no centuries-old aristocratic quarter whose authority had been sedimented through time. Its prestige districts were recent inventions, shaped by migration and speculation. Land that held gardens one decade could host terraces the next. Social boundaries were therefore spatially fragile. They required reinforcement. Architecture provided that reinforcement by fixing hierarchy into masonry. The concentration of elite residences along Fifth Avenue was not incidental. It created a corridor of controlled visual continuity. Facades aligned in height and material established an implicit agreement among their owners: restraint over display, proportion over excess. This collective discipline distinguished the avenue from the commercial density below. It allowed the street itself to function as an institution. Within this environment, deviation carried risk. An overly ornate mansion could undermine the avenue's shared aesthetic code, inviting criticism not only of its owner but of the district's coherence. The Villard Houses adhered carefully to this code. Their Renaissance vocabulary did not compete for novelty. It conformed to a standard recognizable to European observers and American peers alike. Conformity, in this context, was strategic. New American plutocrats faced a paradox. Their wealth derived from innovation, expansion, and industrial disruption. Yet social acceptance required the appearance of continuity and moderation. Architecture reconciled these opposites. It translated aggressive financial accumulation into composed domestic presence. The courtyard at the center of the Villard compound illustrates this reconciliation. Internally, it offered privacy and control, shielding the residences from the unpredictability of the street. Externally, it was invisible, contributing instead to a unified facade that respected the avenue's rhythm. The design balanced inward insulation with outward alignment. Such balance communicated discipline. Discipline was essential because wealth in the Gilded Age was widely scrutinized. Public debates over monopolies, railroad practices, and labor unrest cast suspicion on concentrated capital. Private residences therefore bore a representational burden. They had to imply responsibility, cultivation, and permanence, even when the fortunes behind them were fluid. The Villard Houses did not proclaim industrial might. They invoked Renaissance precedent. This choice redirected attention from the mechanics of wealth to its cultural aspirations. It suggested that the patron understood lineage, proportion, and restraint. In doing so, the architecture moderated the perception of financial power. Architecture also stabilized generational ambition. For a family seeking continuity, a residence signaled intention beyond immediate profit. It implied succession, inheritance, and rootedness. The permanence of stone contrasted with the volatility of markets. By investing in architecture aligned with European tradition, the patron aligned himself with a narrative of endurance. This narrative mattered in a republic without titled nobility. Social rank had to be continuously affirmed. Residences functioned as repositories of that affirmation. Their design encoded values that could be read by peers and rivals alike. The Villard compound therefore operated not only as shelter but as credential. Its coherence strengthened the legitimacy of its owner within a competitive social ecosystem. It reinforced the avenue's authority as a controlled domain of elite identity. In this context, architecture was not aesthetic embellishment, it was structural argument. The late 19th century city demanded visible proof of stability from those who claimed influence. Fifth Avenue became the arena in which that proof was constructed. The Villard Houses participated fully in this arena, embodying the proposition that American capital, disciplined through architecture, could claim permanence within a volatile republic. When Henry Villard commissioned the houses on Madison Avenue, he did not ask for a solitary mansion. He ordered an ensemble. This distinction is structural. A single residence, however grand, remains an individual assertion. A compound suggests system. Villard's decision to construct 6 interconnected houses arranged around a private courtyard was not merely architectural preference, it was spatial governance. The design imposed order not only on stone, but on proximity, access, and hierarchy. Villard's wealth derived from the expansion and consolidation of railroads, networks that reorganized geography itself. Rail infrastructure was about control over distance, over movement, over integration of scattered territories into coordinated systems. The compound he commissioned reflects this same logic. It unified separate dwellings into a single architectural organism. Autonomy was permitted within boundaries. The ensemble remained coherent. This coherence was deliberate. The houses were designed by the architectural firm McKim, Mead White, whose command of Renaissance precedent offered Villard a vocabulary of inherited authority. The choice signaled intention. Renaissance architecture evokes urban palazzi constructed by merchant families who converted trade into political influence. The parallel was unmistakable. Villard was not seeking novelty. He was seeking continuity with an older model of mercantile ascendancy. But unlike the Florentine palazzo, which consolidated family power behind a single facade, Villard's compound extended the concept. By dividing the complex into multiple residences unified by a central courtyard, he created a controlled constellation. It allowed for allied households, family, associates, or chosen intimates to exist within shared perimeter walls. The arrangement was architectural consolidation without absolute singularity. This reflects Villard's ideology of control. Financially, he operated through syndicates, through strategic alliances that expanded reach without diluting authority. The compound embodied this method spatially. Separate structures, coordinated under one patronage, distinct thresholds, but shared enclosure. Insulation was central to this vision. The courtyard, inaccessible from the street, functioned as an interiorized domain. It interrupted Manhattan's grid with an inward-facing void. This was not simply aesthetic. It created psychological separation from the volatility of the surrounding city. Rail markets fluctuated. Political scrutiny intensified. The courtyard remained measured, proportioned, contained. Containment was essential to Villard's self-conception. He did not inherit an aristocratic lineage. His authority was constructed through capital accumulation and corporate maneuvering. Architecture offered a means to stabilize that constructed authority. The disciplined facades, the rusticated stone, the restrained ornament, all suggested inherited certainty rather than speculative assent. The compound format reinforced that suggestion. A single mansion might imply display. An ensemble implied institution. Institutional presence requires boundaries. The compound's alignment along the street established a continuous wall-measured openings, balanced fenestration, unified cornice line. There was no flamboyant interruption. The architecture resisted improvisation. It insisted on control. Control extended inward as well. Circulation between the houses could be managed discreetly. Social interactions were staged within a framework designed to prevent disorder. The architecture choreographed behavior without overt spectacle. In commissioning the compound, Villard was not merely housing himself, he was constructing a spatial manifesto. Capital, he asserted, could engineer its own legitimacy. It could fabricate not only infrastructure across the continent, but continuity within the city. The houses were the material expression of that assertion. They stood as a rebuttal to the instability inherent in railroad finance. Where markets could collapse, stone would endure. Where alliances could fracture, facades would remain aligned. The compound embodied a theory that disciplined architecture could convert volatile wealth into visible permanence. Villard's compound also articulated a hierarchy of visibility. From the street, the ensemble presents a unified front, measured arches, evenly spaced windows, a disciplined roofline. It does not reveal the internal distinctions between the 6 residences. This deliberate uniformity suppresses individual differentiation in favor of collective authority. The message is not personal flamboyance, but controlled magnitude. Such control mirrors the structure of Villard's financial operations. Railroad syndicates required coordination among investors, directors, and political intermediaries. Public perception had to be managed. Confidence was currency. Fragmentation invited speculation. The compound's exterior discipline functions as architectural reassurance. Authority is stable, decisions are centralized, disorder is excluded. Yet within the enclosure, differentiation reappears. Each residence retained internal autonomy, its own sequence of rooms, its own domestic staff. The arrangement allowed for calibrated intimacy proximity without exposure. This reflects a broader ideology of selective access. Power depends not only on consolidation, but on controlled permeability. The courtyard unifies the ensemble while preserving thresholds. Entry is possible, but not unmediated. The choice of Renaissance revival style reinforces this ideology. Renaissance urban palaces were built by merchant families who converted trade into governance. Their architecture signaled civic engagement while fortifying private authority. Thick masonry walls, restrained ornament, symmetrical proportions, these conveyed rationality and restraint. Villard adopted this language precisely because it encoded a model of mercantile aristocracy that had historically transformed commerce into cultural dominance. In late 19th century Manhattan, such symbolism carried strategic weight. Industrial wealth was frequently criticized as speculative and destabilizing. By aligning his residence with a European tradition of measured urban palaces, Villard reframed his financial identity. He positioned himself not as a transient speculator, but as a cultivated patron within a lineage of disciplined capital. The compound format deepened this reframing. A solitary mansion could suggest individual ambition. An ensemble suggested networked authority, family continuity, allied households, institutional presence. It implied that the patron's influence extended beyond personal comfort into structured community. The architecture thus projected stability not merely for a lifetime, but for succession. Succession was implicit in the layout. The presence of multiple houses anticipated generational continuity, marriage alliances, or the accommodation of trusted associates. Even if these functions remained aspirational, their architectural provisions signaled foresight. The compound prepared for permanence. Permanence, however, required more than stone. It required insulation from external volatility. The inward-facing courtyard minimized the city's intrusion. Noise, traffic, and the unpredictability of urban life were moderated by enclosure. This was spatial control exercised against a rapidly modernizing metropolis. The ensemble therefore operates as a counter-grid. Manhattan's street plan enforces uniform blocks and relentless movement. Villard's compound interrupts that flow with an interior void governed by its own proportions. It asserts a localized order within the larger urban matrix. The city may expand and accelerate, but within these walls, geometry remains fixed. This architectural counterpoint embodies Villard's broader ambition. Railroads stitch together distant territories, imposing routes across landscapes. The compound imposes a similar discipline on urban space. It gathers discrete units into a coordinated system. It transforms adjacency into hierarchy. Through this construction, capital attempts to manufacture aristocracy, not by inheriting titles, but by encoding authority into stone, proportion, and controlled access. The Villard Houses become more than residents. They are a spatial doctrine. Wealth disciplined through architecture can simulate lineage, consolidate influence, and claim endurance within a republic defined by flux. The ideology of control is therefore not abstract. It is inscribed in masonry, aligned along Madison Avenue, and organized around a courtyard that answers to a single patronage. The Villard compound was not animated by ornament, it was animated by routine. Behind the disciplined facades, a system operated with precision. The 6 residences, though architecturally unified, were internally calibrated to support a hierarchy of functions. Public rooms occupied the principal floors, aligned along axes designed for reception and display. Service corridors ran parallel but unseen. Staircases bifurcated movement, one ceremonial, one utilitarian. Circulation was engineered to prevent collision between spectacle and labor. The courtyard, so controlled from the exterior, functioned as connective tissue. It allowed movement between houses without exposure to the street. Family members, guests, and trusted associates could traverse the compound under architectural supervision. The enclosure reinforced insulation. It ensured that the organism remained self-contained. Containment required personnel. A Gilded Age household of this scale operated through stratified labor. Butlers, housekeepers, cooks, footmen, chambermaids, coachmen. Each role occupied a defined position within a hierarchy that mirrored the structure of the building itself. Authority flowed downward from the patron through managerial staff to service workers. The architecture accommodated this chain of command. Basements and rear wings housed kitchens and storage rooms. Deliveries entered through secondary doors, timed to avoid visibility during formal hours. Coal was stored, linens laundered, silver polished, all without disrupting the curated calm of reception rooms above. The building's plan absorbed the noise and heat of labor, converting it into seamless domestic performance. Time was regulated. Breakfast, calls, dinners, receptions, each followed a script. Invitations were issued with deliberation. Carriages arrived in sequence. Guests were guided through specific thresholds designed to stage arrival. The principal staircase framed ascent. Drawing rooms were arranged to facilitate controlled conversation. Even furniture placement reinforced social geometry. This choreography depended on discipline. The patron's authority extended into daily detail. Menus reflected seasonal availability and status. Floral arrangements were selected for symbolism and freshness. Candles were replaced before they guttered. Nothing appeared accidental. The house presented an illusion of effortlessness sustained by concealed coordination. Capital underwrote this illusion. Maintenance costs were continuous. Stone required cleaning. Heating demanded fuel. Staff wages accumulated weekly. Repairs were scheduled to prevent visible decay. The compound consumed money at a steady pace, converting financial liquidity into architectural and social stability. Without that flow, the system would stall. The interconnected nature of the residences amplified this requirement. Shared infrastructure heating, service corridors, courtyard maintenance necessitated centralized oversight. Though the houses could function independently, their design encouraged cooperation. The compound behaved as a single organism with multiple chambers. Privacy and surveillance coexisted. The architecture enabled observation without intrusion. Servants could monitor entrances discreetly. Doors and corridors allowed movement unseen by guests. The courtyard, enclosed and proportioned, limited external vantage points. Control of visibility preserved hierarchy. Within this framework, domestic life was not spontaneous. It was curated. Children, if present, occupied defined zones. Tutors arrived at appointed hours. Music drifted through salons under supervision. Even leisure adhered to protocol. The house functioned less as a retreat than as an apparatus for reinforcing identity. Every gesture, from the selection of porcelain to the arrangement of seating, contributed to a narrative of cultivated authority. The machinery extended beyond walls. Account books tracked expenditures. Correspondence was managed by secretaries. Invitations were archived. Social alliances were recorded through dinners and introductions. The compound served as headquarters for both domestic and financial coordination. Meetings could occur within drawing rooms insulated from commercial scrutiny. In this way, the Villard Houses operated as an extension of capital's infrastructure. Railroads managed routes and timetables across the continent. The compound managed presence and perception within the city. Both required synchronized systems, disciplined oversight, and steady expenditure. The organism breathed through order. Disruption, whether in staff turnover, financial strain, or social miscalculation, threatened coherence. Therefore, redundancy was built into the system. Assistant staff shadowed senior servants, supplies were stocked in advance, repairs were preventive rather than reactive. Stability depended on anticipation. The building did not merely shelter authority. It manufactured it daily through repetition, coordination, and the constant conversion of money into controlled experience. The compound's internal order extended beyond hospitality and into governance. The principal rooms were not only for dinners and calls, they were sites of negotiation. Financial discussions could occur in spaces calibrated to project composure. The thickness of the walls and the insulation of the courtyard ensured discretion. Within these rooms, decisions concerning investments, partnerships, and strategic alignments could be framed by architectural authority. Authority is amplified by setting. The measured proportions of the salons, the weight of carved mantels, the filtered light through tall windows, all reinforce the impression of stability. Guests entering such spaces encountered not merely a host but a system. The environment itself suggested continuity, discouraging impulsiveness. Conversations unfolded within parameters defined by symmetry and restraint. This architectural containment supported social filtration. Access to the compound was selective. Invitations were extended with care, and acceptance implied recognition within a closed circle. The guest list functioned as a map of influence. Those admitted participated in a shared affirmation of status. The building's thresholds therefore acted as social gates, admitting some, excluding others, without public declaration. Inside, the hierarchy of staff reinforced this filtration. Senior servants controlled approach to the patron. Calls could be deferred, messages screened, schedules managed to protect priority engagements. The machinery of the household ensured that attention-like access was allocated strategically. Such regulation required financial elasticity. Expenses fluctuated with the social calendar. A season of receptions increased consumption of food, coal, and labor hours. Linen inventories expanded. Florists were engaged more frequently. The compound's accounts reflected not only domestic needs, but reputational maintenance. Hospitality operated as investment. Capital was converted into atmosphere. Heating systems ensured comfort in winter months, preserving the viability of social gatherings. Gas lighting illuminated evening receptions before electrification became widespread. As technologies advanced, the compound absorbed them selectively, incorporating innovation without compromising stylistic coherence. Adaptation occurred beneath the surface, preserving the facade's disciplined continuity. The staff's routines were synchronized with this technological infrastructure. Boiler maintenance followed precise schedules. Deliveries were coordinated to avoid congestion in service corridors. Waste was removed discreetly. The organism's survival depended on predictability. Predictability fostered confidence. For those within the compound, daily life followed an established rhythm. Morning preparations led to afternoon calls. Evenings culminated in formal dinners or private consultations. The repetition of these patterns stabilized identity. The building's architecture reinforced that stability by limiting improvisation. Corridors directed movement, doorways framed encounter, furniture anchored conversation. Yet this stability was not static. Seasonal migrations to summer estates or European travel required the compound to enter phases of partial dormancy. Staff numbers adjusted. Rooms were closed and reopened. Even in reduced operation, maintenance continued. Stone and timber required vigilance. Absence could not be allowed to erode the material assertion of permanence. The machinery therefore extended into periods of quiet. Bookkeepers maintained accounts regardless of occupancy. Housekeepers monitored environmental conditions. Repairs were undertaken while social activity paused. The compound's continuity did not depend solely on spectacle. It relied on constant, disciplined oversight. Within this system, individuality receded before function. The patron's preferences shaped menus and decor, yet the building's operation transcended personality. It required processes that could endure beyond a single presence. The hierarchy of staff, the standardized routines, the financial provisioning, all suggested aspiration toward institutional life rather than temporary habitation. The Villard Houses, at their operational height, behaved less like a residence and more like a regulated enterprise. Rooms received guests as departments received clients. Staff performed roles analogous to corporate positions. Resources were allocated, performance evaluated, and adjustments implemented to maintain coherence. The compound's architecture provided the framework. Money supplied the energy. Discipline ensured continuity. In this way, the machinery of the Gilded household sustained not only comfort but authority. It translated financial capital into daily ritual, embedding power into routine. The organism functioned quietly, without visible strain, so long as the flow of money and command remained uninterrupted. There was a period measured less in decades than in seasons, when the Villard Houses operated exactly as intended. The compound did not merely function, it aligned. Financial authority, social legitimacy, architectural discipline, and urban geography converged into temporary coherence. The system required no adjustment. Money flowed. Invitations were accepted. The courtyard remained insulated. The facade held its line against Madison Avenue with quiet assurance. This was not ostentation. It was calibration. The late 19th century city was consolidating its role as the financial center of the Republic. Rail networks linked interior markets to Atlantic ports. Banks expanded their influence. Insurance firms and brokerage houses formalized structures that would define American capitalism. Manhattan's authority was becoming infrastructural rather than regional. Within this ascent, the Villard compound stood as domestic counterpart to institutional growth. Its rooms received individuals whose decisions shaped markets. Conversations conducted beneath its ceilings had consequences beyond the block. Yet the atmosphere was not transactional in tone. It was cultivated. Discussions of credit, expansion, and alliance occurred within surroundings that framed such topics as extensions of social order rather than raw speculation. The architecture performed containment. The courtyard shielded activity from public scrutiny. The unified facade suppressed signs of internal negotiation. What occurred within the compound remained within it. This discretion enhanced credibility. Confidence in markets depends on perception as much as liquidity. The building's disciplined exterior reinforced the impression that authority inside was stable. Stability invited participation. Those admitted into the compound's social orbit entered a calibrated environment. Seating arrangements signaled hierarchy without announcement. Dining protocols reinforced alliances through proximity. Receptions were structured to ensure that conversation unfolded along intended lines. The building's geometry supported this choreography, preventing disorder. At this apex, the system's various layers, financial, architectural, social, operated in synchrony. Maintenance costs were absorbed without strain. Staff retention remained consistent, preserving continuity of service. The courtyard's masonry required care but not intervention. Heating systems functioned reliably. The organism breathed without visible effort. The compound's presence on Madison Avenue also resonated beyond its walls. Its disciplined Renaissance vocabulary contributed to the avenue's cumulative authority. Other residences, aligned in material and proportion, reinforced the district's coherence. Together, they formed a corridor of measured power. The Villard Houses participated fully in this corridor. They neither dominated nor receded. Their strength lay in alignment. The ensemble format suggested networked authority rather than isolated display. It reflected a model of elite cohesion at a moment when Manhattan's leading figures were consolidating influence across industries. Confidence is rarely loud, it is structural. Within the compound, ritual reinforced that structure. Seasonal receptions confirmed social bonds. Invitations circulated among a circle increasingly aware of its collective reach. The architecture absorbed these confirmations and reflected them outward through permanence. The building did not need explanation during this period. Its authority was understood. The facade did not require plaques. The courtyard did not require interpretation. The compound's coherence mirrored the city's expanding financial infrastructure. For a time, the proposition inscribed in stone appeared validated. Disciplined capital could generate both wealth and cultural legitimacy. The Villard Houses stood as proof. During this interval, the compound's authority was reinforced by repetition. Season followed season without rupture. Winter gatherings unfolded beneath controlled illumination. Spring calls reactivated established circuits of visitation. The building's rhythm synchronized with the city's financial calendar. Market expansions coincided with social assurance. There was no visible contradiction between speculative ambition and cultivated restraint. The ensemble's format proved advantageous in this environment. Its multiple residences allowed simultaneous layers of engagement. Private consultations could occur in one wing, while formal receptions occupied another. The courtyard mediated these activities, maintaining insulation without fragmentation. Movement between houses remained internal, controlled, unseen. The organism was self-sustaining. Confidence extended to material upkeep. Stonework was cleaned and inspected as routine rather than emergency. Interiors were refreshed without altering stylistic coherence. Technological adjustments, improvements in lighting or heating, were integrated discreetly. Innovation did not disturb the architectural thesis, it reinforced it. Externally, the compound contributed to a collective architectural consensus along the avenue. The repetition of masonry facades, the shared height lines, the disciplined ornamentation. These elements transformed individual residences into a coordinated front. Manhattan's elite district acquired visual continuity. The Villard Houses were a central component of that continuity. Within such a district, legitimacy became spatially reinforced. To reside here was to participate in a stabilized hierarchy. Visitors understood the code without instruction. Carriages slowed in recognition of familiar facades. Invitations circulated among those already visible within the corridor. This visibility fostered cohesion. Financial alliances strengthened when reinforced by social proximity. Business partnerships overlapped with domestic acquaintance. The architecture facilitated this overlap by providing neutral yet authoritative space. Drawing rooms framed conversation in tones of measured deliberation rather than urgency. Decisions could be reached without theatrical display. The compound's interior order mirrored Manhattan's expanding institutional order. Banks formalized charters. Exchanges standardized procedures. Corporate boards consolidated oversight. Within the Villard Houses, parallel systems of regulation and hierarchy sustained domestic equilibrium. The house and the city advanced in tandem. There was, for a moment, no visible tension between scale and stability. The compound embodied a belief that American capital had matured beyond volatility. Its disciplined Renaissance vocabulary suggested inheritance rather than improvisation. Its unified facade implied generational continuity. Within its walls, authority felt secure enough to be understated. Yet this apex was inherently dependent on uninterrupted flow of money, of confidence, of alliances. The building's calm presupposed continuity in financial structures that remained, at their core, exposed to speculation. Stone suggested permanence. Markets did not. During this period, however, the illusion held. The Villard Houses fulfilled their intended role. They hosted without strain, symbolized without exaggeration, and stabilized a circle of influence that regarded itself as enduring. The compound stood as domestic confirmation of Manhattan's ascent. Assured, consolidated, architecturally disciplined. For a time, coherence appeared complete. Stone suggests permanence. Capital does not. The same speculative mechanisms that enabled Henry Villard's ascent railroad expansion, financed through aggressive syndication and leveraged confidence, contained within them the seeds of instability. Markets that reward rapid consolidation also punish overextension. Infrastructure projects required vast upfront investment, and their returns depended on projections of growth that were never entirely secure. For a period, confidence masked exposure. Rail lines extended across territories with the promise of future traffic. Bonds were issued against anticipated revenue. Investors accepted risk in exchange for participation in continental expansion. The architecture on Madison Avenue reflected this atmosphere of assured projection. Yet projection is not continuity. Financial reversals began not with architectural failure but with market recalibration. Shifts in credit conditions, fluctuations in freight revenue, and the inherent volatility of speculative enterprise eroded the stability that had underwritten Villard's authority. Confidence, once abundant, narrowed. Investors reconsidered commitments. Obligations remained fixed even as returns contracted. The compound on Madison Avenue did not register these pressures visibly at first. Its facade maintained composure. The courtyard retained its proportion. Staff routines continued. But the flow of capital sustaining this machinery tightened. Architecture absorbed strain differently than markets. Railroads could enter receivership. Bonds could be renegotiated. Corporate structures could be reorganized. Stone, by contrast, persists in place. Its maintenance demands do not diminish in sympathy with financial contraction. Heating systems still require fuel. Staff wages remain due. Repairs cannot be indefinitely deferred without consequence. As Villard's financial position weakened, the ideological coherence of the compound began to fracture. The ensemble had embodied consolidated authority. That authority was now contested by creditors and market realities beyond the patron's immediate control. Ownership is not merely legal, it is psychological. The compound's design assumed a singular patronage, directing expenditure and social choreography. When that patronage faltered, the building's internal logic lost its anchor. Decisions that once reflected confidence became constrained by obligation. Hospitality, once investment in legitimacy, risked becoming liability. Financial fragility revealed a structural truth: the architecture's permanence depended on continuous liquidity. Without steady capital, insulation became burden. The courtyard, once symbol of controlled enclosure, became a reminder of fixed costs in a city where fortunes could shift rapidly. The shift in ownership that followed did not immediately alter the compound's appearance. Transfers of title occurred within legal frameworks that preserved facade and layout. But ownership carries ideology. A new proprietor inherits walls without inheriting the precise ambition that shaped them. The ensemble remained intact. Its meaning did not. The speculative ethos that had animated its creation was replaced by recalculation, where once there had been expansive projection, there was now containment. Maintenance decisions became measured against reduced means. The building endured, but its governing certainty diminished. Financial fragility beneath stone is not theatrical collapse. It is gradual displacement of assurance by caution. The compound continued to function, but under altered conditions that expose the distance between architectural permanence and economic volatility. The erosion of financial certainty did not produce immediate ruin. It produced adjustment. Receivership and restructuring were mechanisms familiar to the railroad world. Lines were reorganized, boards reconstituted, liabilities redistributed. Villard himself would experience the cycle of ascent and reversal more than once. But architecture does not reorganize as fluidly as corporate charters. It remains fixed in location, scale, and cost. When ownership shifted, the compound entered a different logic of stewardship. A residence built as a manifesto of consolidated authority now required practical management under altered circumstances. The ensemble format, once a declaration of cohesion, posed challenges for new proprietors. Multiple houses under unified facade demanded coordinated maintenance, yet no longer symbolized a single patron's ideology. The architecture outlived the narrative that justified its scale. This disjunction introduced tension. The building's materials still spoke of permanence. Rusticated stone and Renaissance proportion implied generational continuity, yet the financial structures behind them had proven susceptible to market contraction. The gap between appearance and economic reality widened. In such moments, architecture becomes a reminder rather than reinforcement. Rooms designed for confident hospitality felt different under constrained conditions. Receptions, if held, carried the weight of recalculation. Staff numbers could not always be sustained at previous levels. Repairs might be deferred or negotiated. The machinery described in earlier years required steady expenditure. Fragility exposed its dependency. The ideological fracture was subtle but consequential. The compound had embodied a belief that disciplined capital could manufacture stability equivalent to inherited aristocracy. Financial reversals unsettled that belief. The houses remained visually composed, but the proposition they advanced, that wealth could engineer permanence, was no longer unquestioned. Manhattan itself was adjusting during this period. Financial crises and recoveries reshaped perceptions of risk. Industrial consolidation continued, but with increasing awareness of volatility. The district along Fifth Avenue retained prestige, yet the city's economic rhythms revealed their unpredictability. Within this broader recalibration, the Villard Houses ceased to function as unambiguous symbols of ascendancy. They became artifacts of a particular moment of confidence. Their stone held its line, but the certainty that once animated its alignment had dissipated. Ownership transitions reinforced this shift. Each transfer diluted the singularity of intent. A building conceived as extension of one man's theory of control entered the impersonal processes of property exchange. Contracts replaced conviction. Legal instruments substituted for architectural manifesto. The palace outlived its creator's financial certainty. This endurance is not triumph. It is inertia. Architecture can survive ideological fracture because stone is indifferent to narrative, yet the meaning attached to it evolves with circumstance. The compound, once evidence of consolidated empire, now stood as testimony to the vulnerability beneath speculative expansion. Financial fragility did not dismantle the Villard Houses. It destabilized the coherence that had unified their purpose. The walls remained aligned along Madison Avenue, but the conviction that built them no longer governed their existence. Time altered the compound, not through catastrophe, but through recalculation. As the decades advanced into the 20th century, the logic sustaining large private residences in Manhattan weakened. The city's center of gravity shifted northward. Commercial districts expanded. Corporate headquarters replaced drawing rooms as sites of influence. Domestic compounds of such scale required continuous expenditure without generating direct return. Maintenance, once expression of confidence, became obligation. Stone facades demanded cleaning and repointing. Roof lines required reinforcement against weather and age. Interior woodwork, exposed to seasonal fluctuations, needed careful conservation. These tasks had once been absorbed into the steady flow of capital. Under new ownership structures and changing economic priorities, they became items on ledgers to be justified. The compound's ensemble format, so deliberate in its conception, complicated adaptation. 6 interconnected houses around a courtyard did not easily translate into modern living arrangements. Heating systems aged, plumbing required modernization, electrical infrastructure demanded retrofitting. Each intervention posed a question: preserve, alter, or subdivide. Subdivision introduced a new logic. Where once the compound functioned as unified organism, separate ownership or tenancy offered financial relief. Portions could be leased. Individual houses might be sold independently. The courtyard, originally the symbolic center of insulation, became shared space requiring negotiation among stakeholders. This fragmentation marked a conceptual shift. The property was no longer primarily sanctuary. It was asset. Manhattan's rising land values intensified this recalibration. Real estate along Madison Avenue acquired significance beyond residential prestige. Office buildings multiplied. Towers rose where mansions had stood. Air rights became negotiable commodities. In this environment, the Villard Houses occupied valuable ground whose potential exceeded domestic function. Commercial logic pressed inward. Preservation sentiment, emerging more forcefully mid-century, introduced another layer of negotiation. Architectural historians and civic advocates recognized the compound's significance as rare survivor of a Gilded Age ensemble. Landmark designation promised protection of facade and key interiors. Yet preservation did not restore original ideology, it redefined value. Value shifted from private authority to historical distinction. Negotiations between owners and preservation bodies reframed the building's purpose. Restoration budgets were evaluated against potential revenue streams. Adaptive reuse was discussed as compromise between demolition and stagnation. The compound's survival depended not on a patron's devotion, but on its capacity to justify itself within market structures. Extraction replaced continuity. Where earlier decades had invested in maintenance to reinforce identity, later years evaluated interventions in terms of return. Could the property accommodate offices, event space, institutional tenants? Each proposal recalibrated the building's internal configuration. Service corridors were reconsidered, rooms were repurposed, the courtyard's enclosure was assessed for its commercial appeal. Stewardship implies guardianship for future generations aligned with original purpose. Monetization implies adaptation to present demand. The distinction is subtle but decisive. The Villard Houses entered an era in which their architectural integrity required economic justification beyond private residence. Their survival would depend on their ability to participate in a marketplace that no longer valued aristocratic insulation but rewarded flexibility and yield. As commercial pressures intensified, the compound's coherence was measured against opportunity cost. Developers evaluated the site not as manifesto, but as footprint. The question was no longer how best to preserve an ideology of controlled domestic authority, but how to maximize value within zoning constraints. Surrounding parcels had already yielded to vertical expansion. Towers demonstrated what the land could produce when liberated from horizontal restraint. Against this backdrop, the Villard Houses were both obstacle and asset. They occupied ground that could, in purely economic terms, support greater density. Yet, their architectural distinction offered differentiation in an increasingly uniform commercial district. The compound's Renaissance facades, once symbols of cultivated continuity, now functioned as branding potential. Negotiations with preservation authorities formalized this transformation. Landmark status protected exteriors and significant interiors from demolition or drastic alteration. It constrained extraction in one dimension while enabling it in another. If the facades could not be replaced, they could be incorporated. If interiors could not be erased, they could be repurposed. Adaptation proceeded through compromise. Portions of the compound were sold or leased to institutions seeking prestige address rather than private sanctuary. Rooms once calibrated for domestic ritual were recalibrated for offices, meeting spaces, and receptions unmoored from family continuity. Infrastructure upgrades were introduced with caution, threading modern systems through historic fabric. Each intervention reinforced the shift from stewardship to monetization. Maintenance decisions were now evaluated within projected revenue frameworks. Restoration budgets required forecasts. Investment was justified by anticipated returns, whether through rental income, event bookings, or enhanced property value in adjacent development. The compound's survival was secured not by devotion to its founding narrative, but by integration into contemporary economic calculus. The courtyard illustrates this recalibration. Originally conceived as insulated interior void, it became visual amenity. Its proportions and masonry were marketed as atmospheric distinction. What had once been private geometry became shared spectacle. The enclosure persisted, but its meaning inverted. The rise of corporate Manhattan accelerated this inversion. Financial institutions, hospitality brands, and multinational firms required recognizable heritage to temper modern scale. The Villard Houses offered such heritage. Their facades could soften the impact of glass towers. Their interiors could lend gravitas to commercial functions. Integration into larger developments became viable precisely because the compound carried historic weight. Extraction, in this context, was not demolition, but assimilation. The building's aesthetic capital was leveraged. Its rarity increased its market appeal. Developers could promise continuity while pursuing density. Preservationists could claim victory in safeguarding stone, even as purpose shifted irrevocably. Continuity yielded to commercial logic, yet the transition was incremental rather than abrupt. Stone was cleaned, interiors restored, mechanical systems updated. The compound remained visually disciplined, but the governing rationale had changed. Decisions originated in boardrooms and planning commissions rather than in a singular patron's intention. The Villard Houses entered late 20th century Manhattan as participants in a new economy, one that valued heritage as asset, enclosure as experience, and architecture as component within larger financial structures. Stewardship, once anchored in ideology, had been replaced by strategic incorporation. The compound endured, but under terms defined less by continuity of purpose than by adaptability to profit. The final transformation did not arrive as rupture, it arrived as proposal. By the late 20th century, Midtown Manhattan operated under a consolidated commercial logic. Vertical expansion was not merely aesthetic preference, it was financial necessity. Parcels were evaluated according to density potential, proximity to transit, and adjacency to corporate corridors. The Villard Houses, intact but horizontally restrained, occupied land capable of far greater yield. Demolition was considered. Preservation intervened. Compromise emerged. The solution was integration. A modern tower would rise above and behind the compound, absorbing its footprint into a larger hospitality complex. The historic facades would remain. The courtyard would be retained. Significant interiors would be restored. Yet the governing structure would shift decisively toward corporate hospitality. This was not preservation in isolation. It was preservation through incorporation. The development introduced a vertical mass that recalibrated the site's hierarchy. The Renaissance facades, once primary expressions of authority along Madison Avenue, became architectural base. Above them rose glass and steel, calibrated for contemporary expectations. Guest rooms stacked in repetition, elevators aligned for efficiency, mechanical systems concealed within a grid of corporate regularity. The compound entered a new organism. Within this organism, function followed brand logic. Guest experience replaced domestic ritual. The reception desk assumed a role once occupied by private staff screening entry. Event programming replaced invitation lists. Bookings, conferences, and seasonal occupancy rates governed interior use. The houses were preserved structurally, yet their autonomy dissolved. Rooms that had once hosted calibrated social alliances now hosted transient clientele. The courtyard, formerly insulated from the city, became shared amenity, photographed, traversed, scheduled. Its geometry remained unchanged, its purpose inverted. Corporate governance replaced singular patronage. Decision-making moved from a household hierarchy to managerial frameworks operating across cities and continents. Budgets were allocated through centralized planning. Renovations adhered to brand standards. Maintenance cycles were determined by hospitality metrics rather than domestic continuity. The building's material integrity was sustained through this system, but its ideological coherence shifted. Where once architecture embodied a theory of consolidated private authority, it now functioned as curated distinction within a portfolio. The integration required technical adaptation. Modern fire codes, accessibility standards, climate control systems, and security infrastructure were threaded through historic fabric. Engineers navigated load-bearing masonry to accommodate elevators and mechanical shafts serving the adjacent tower. The compound's endurance depended on its compatibility with contemporary regulation. Compatibility ensured survival. Incorporation into a major hotel development provided steady capital for restoration. Stone was cleaned with precision. Woodwork was conserved. Decorative elements were stabilized. The compound received attention that private ownership alone might not have sustained under modern conditions. Yet attention was no longer devotion, it was strategy. The Villard Houses became a heritage layer distinguishing the hotel from competitors, lending historical gravitas to contemporary luxury. Their presence offered narrative depth in marketing materials. Guests were invited to experience history, though the experience unfolded within standardized hospitality frameworks. The organism survived. Its governing mind, however, had changed. Integration altered not only function but authority. Under private patronage, decisions concerning the compound had once been localized. Expenditure, repair, invitation, and access were determined within a closed hierarchy. After incorporation into the hotel development, authority dispersed into corporate channels. Managers reported to regional offices. Budgets aligned with shareholder expectations. Strategy extended beyond Madison Avenue. The compound became accountable to systems indifferent to its original thesis. Hospitality operates through repetition and scalability. Room categories are standardized. Guest services are optimized for efficiency. Metrics govern staffing levels and pricing models. Within this framework, the Villard Houses function as premium space, distinguished by craftsmanship, yet bound by uniform operational protocols. The courtyard exemplifies this recalibration. Its enclosure once regulated privacy, now it enhances atmosphere. Lighting is adjusted to support evening events. Seating arrangements are configured for banquets or receptions. The void that once insulated domestic life now facilitates programmed gatherings scheduled months in advance. Scheduling replaced spontaneity. The building's calendar is determined by conference bookings, wedding contracts, and seasonal tourism patterns. Occupancy forecasts shape staffing and maintenance cycles. The compound's survival depends on performance indicators rather than generational continuity. This shift does not diminish the stone, it reassigns its meaning. The Renaissance facade continues to project composure onto Madison Avenue. Its arches and cornices maintain proportion against the surrounding tower. Yet the tower commands economic primacy. Elevators carry guests vertically into standardized rooms whose repetition generates revenue. The historic houses ground the development visually. The tower sustains it financially. The organism's hierarchy inverted. Where the compound once embodied central authority with ancillary staff and functions supporting it, it now operates as distinguished appendage within a larger corporate body. The tower's mechanical systems, booking platforms, and international marketing networks form the dominant infrastructure. The historic structure contributes differentiation, not direction. Integration also altered the building's audience. The original compound addressed a narrow circle of peers. Its authority depended on exclusion. Within the hotel complex, the audience expands to global clientele. Access is no longer governed by lineage or invitation, but by reservation and rate. The thresholds remain physical, but their criteria have changed. Access became transactional. Preservation, in this context, operates as asset protection. Landmark status ensures that facades and key interiors are maintained, not for singular devotion, but for brand distinction and regulatory compliance. Restoration budgets are justified by market positioning. The building's survival is secured through participation in competitive hospitality. Corporate Manhattan absorbs what it cannot erase. Rather than demolish the Villard Houses, it internalized them. Their architectural discipline tempers the surrounding modernity. Their courtyard provides rare enclosure amid vertical density. Their history offers narrative depth to a global brand. Yet integration completed the transformation initiated decades earlier. The compound no longer embodies a theory of private empire. It exemplifies adaptive incorporation. Its walls remain intact. Its purpose has been reassigned. The organism endures within a larger system whose priorities originate elsewhere. The stone holds its composure. The governing mind belongs to corporate Manhattan. The Villard Houses endure. Their facades remain measured against Madison Avenue. Their courtyard still gathers light in a geometry conceived more than a century ago. Interior ceilings retain carved detail, fireplaces anchor rooms whose proportions have not shifted. Preservation has ensured that material continuity persists. Yet intention does not fossilize as easily as stone. The compound was conceived as architectural doctrine. It asserted that capital, disciplined through Renaissance precedent, could manufacture permanence within a republic defined by volatility. It organized proximity, access, and hierarchy to reinforce consolidated private authority. That doctrine required singular patronage and unified purpose. Those conditions have dissolved. The building survives as protected interior space, admired for craftsmanship and rare coherence. Visitors move through its rooms aware, if briefly, of age and restraint. The stone communicates weight. The arches imply lineage. The courtyard suggests enclosure distinct from the city's relentless grid. But the architecture no longer enforces a governing theory. Authority has migrated into abstract systems, corporate structures, financial markets, regulatory frameworks that do not require masonry for validation. The compound's original role as spatial guarantor of private empire has been replaced by a quieter function, atmosphere, distinction, curated history. The question is not whether the building survives materially. It does. The question is whether survival without sovereignty constitutes continuity. Preservation secures walls, cornices, staircases. It does not secure intention. The Renaissance vocabulary remains legible, yet the ideology it once advanced, disciplined capital aspiring toward aristocratic permanence, no longer directs the building's operation. The compound has become artifact rather than instrument. Artifact implies distance. Where once architecture shaped behavior through restriction and ritual, it now accommodates behavior determined by external scheduling. Guests photograph ceilings that were never designed for public display. Events unfold beneath arches conceived for calibrated domestic alliances. The building's material discipline persists. Its governing narrative has thinned. In this thinning, a different form of endurance appears. The compound no longer stabilizes private authority, yet it stabilizes memory. Its presence interrupts the vertical assertiveness of surrounding towers. It offers evidence that Manhattan's current logic was not inevitable, but layered over prior regimes of power. The stone registers continuity even as intention recedes. What remains, then, is not empire but trace. The Villard Houses stand as preserved architecture integrated into corporate Manhattan. Their legacy is not the perpetuation of Villard's ideology, but the survival of its material expression. The ensemble still gathers light around its courtyard. It still aligns its facades in disciplined proportion. Whether that constitutes survival or aesthetic memory remains unresolved. Preservation confers legitimacy of a different kind. By designating the Villard Houses as landmarks, the city affirmed their architectural significance. The facades are protected not because they enforce authority, but because they represent a chapter in urban formation. Their stone is now valued as document. Craftsmanship replaces control as the primary justification for endurance. In this transition, the compound's meaning stabilizes at the level of surface. Visitors recognize arches, rustication, symmetry. They may note the rarity of an intact Gilded Age ensemble. The building's discipline is legible as style. What is less legible is the original calculus of power that produced it. The ambition to insulate capital within masonry, to convert financial volatility into spatial permanence. Style persists, system dissolves. The courtyard still mediates light and shadow. Yet it no longer regulates exclusivity. The thresholds remain, but their criteria are transactional. The hierarchy once embedded in corridors and staircases has flattened into hospitality flow. The architecture survives as environment rather than enforcement. This distinction clarifies the building's contemporary status. It functions as reminder without command. Its walls suggest endurance while operating within frameworks that prioritize adaptability and yield. The compound no longer shapes the city's hierarchy. It inhabits it as curated layer. There is, however, a residual authority in material survival. Stone laid in the 19th century resists erasure. It interrupts the uniformity of glass towers. It compels acknowledgement of earlier regimes of power that organized Manhattan differently, horizontally, domestically, privately. The Villard Houses retain the capacity to slow perception. They create pause within acceleration. Pause is not sovereignty, but it is presence. The building's endurance demonstrates that architectural form can outlast ideological coherence. The compound no longer asserts that capital can manufacture aristocracy. That argument belongs to another era. Yet the masonry holds its argument silently, even if the city no longer debates it. Preservation without authority produces a specific kind of legacy. It offers continuity of material while relinquishing continuity of intention. It safeguards craftsmanship while conceding control. The Villard houses endure as protected interiors, integrated into a corporate organism whose priorities originate elsewhere. The organism that once animated the compound has been replaced, but the shell remains articulate. In that articulation lies the final ambiguity. The houses are neither ruin nor relic in isolation. They are functioning space embedded within contemporary systems. They generate revenue, host events, and maintain structural integrity. At the same time, they stand as evidence of a moment when architecture attempted to stabilize private empire. What remains when intention disappears is not emptiness. It is residue stone, proportion, courtyard light, persisting within altered governance. The Villard houses endure, intact and maintained, their original sovereignty dissolved, yet their material discipline unbroken.